Hi, my name is Ann Werda, and we're going to talk about writing great rubrics and what that really entails. You know, in all honesty, your assessment is only as good as your rubric. You can have some great performance assessments or really great open-ended essay questions or tasks for your students, but if you have no way to delineate how you're going to be giving points or to ensure your own consistency as a grader, you're not going to be getting very useful data back from that particular tool. So we want to talk about how we can be sure that we're using our grading in a reliable and repeatable fashion. You know, I used to sit down with a pile of essays, my coffee, and a rubric, and I'd just start grading. And as I went through the pile of essays, I'd get about halfway through and I'd go back and read the first one that I graded, and I'd think to myself, man, was I mean. Maybe it was my coffee getting into my system, or maybe it was my expectations changing as I went through the pile of papers. But what I thought was a 3 at the beginning was not a 3 by the middle, and maybe it was more like a 3.5 or a 4. I started to change the way I was grading as I went through that work. And that's what we call non-reliable use of the tool. That's not consistent, it's not fair to the students, and it's not going to give me a good data set for analysis purposes. So we want to make sure that we design a rubric that is what we call a descriptive rubric that's incredibly clear and gives us really good expectations for how we're going to assign points and how we're going to grade our students, as well as communicating those expectations to the students so the students know what we're looking for. Rubrics should be used anytime you have a question that's not selected response. So anytime you're not presenting the students with both the right and the wrong answer, you should be using a rubric. That's any constructed response, open-ended question, performance tasks, behavior grading, any kinds of those tasks that you're not providing wrong answers to the student. Those require a rubric. Now, rubrics are great tools because they help to find quality for a process, a product, or any behavior that we're looking for the student. So that's helpful for us as a teacher. It also helps us to have a good understanding of not only what we need to teach the students, but what those learning expectations might be. It helps us to communicate what it takes to succeed, and it also helps us to increase our reliability. It increases the consistency not only between grading more than one student, but also between different graders and different measurement points. And when it comes to growth, that's going to be huge. To make sure that we're grading in the same way 3 months from now will be really important in getting comparable data. Now, rubrics are awesome for students as well because it helps the student see what the definition for quality in that process, product, or behavior might be. It also helps the student who is able to read the rubric have a more thoughtful judgment of their own and even others' work if they're going to be using that rubric to help peer assess. It increases their ability to self-assess as well as increasing their own responsibility and taking ownership in what they need to do to move to the next level in their own learning. Now, rubrics are great tools to help us with something that we call reliability. Reliability is the repeatability of results. So theoretically, if you were to develop an assessment and give it to several different groups of similar students, you should get relatively similar results. That would be a reliable tool. When you're using a rubric, it helps to make sure that you're going to be giving similar scores to similar responses because it really fleshes out what we're looking for each of the different descriptors. This is going to be helpful in 2 different kinds of reliability, what we call inter-rater reliability. So that's reliability between more than one person grading the same piece, grading with the same tool. So for example, if you have several teachers that are on a team that are all using the same rubric, making sure that we're all using it in the same fashion. And then something called intra-rater reliability, which arguably is the more important element in the growth assessment. So this is when one teacher uses the same rubric to grade the same student over time. So maybe there's a similar task that we're asking. Maybe it's a written response and it's 2 different essays that are written towards a similar type of prompt and we're using the same rubric. But if we want to be able to compare that data, it needs to be collected in a very, very repeatable fashion. And so by having a really great rubric that is incredibly descriptive, we will have a better chance of higher levels of reliability. Additionally, if you get a team together and you practice grading together, so you all look at one student sample or one recording of a student or a sample of their work and then grade it as a team, you can come to consensus on the difference between a 3 and a 4 and why more than one teacher may have used that rubric differently. If you're going to just do it by yourself, having a sample on file will help you to zero your thinking like you would zero a scale before you weigh yourself. This gets you back to the baseline and says, okay, what are my expectations before I jump into using this tool? Rubrics are going to be really important in your constructed response questions and then your performance questions. So that means those questions that are designed for a student to have a free response answer, so they're writing out an answer, whether it's showing their work or showing their thinking. And then of course, when they're asked to complete a task or to do something in order to convey their thinking on that particular topic. So a great rubric typically is designed with rows that show each of the criteria you plan to measure. These are each of the essential pieces for this task. And of course, it's not going to define everything you might be able to measure, but only those things you've decided are really important. The columns typically represent the ranges and levels of performance. Usually this ranges from ideal to not evident at all. And then each of those rating boxes should be a detailed description of what performance should look like at that particular level. Let's look at an example rubric. This is a rubric that was for an art project that showed whether students were following directions and using, understanding the creativity and using good craftsmanship. Now each of the rows were what the teacher planned to measure. So we could discuss whether each of those rows were important to that curriculum and they were essential things to measure on the rubric. The columns were labeled with faces showing how the teacher felt when looking at that work. So of course the best is super happy and the worst is somebody who looks kind of scared. Then we could see that each of the rating boxes should be detailed descriptions of performance at that level. You know, of course, each of these boxes don't have any ratings. In fact, if you wanted to see a student following directions, they could follow directions in the very happy way, frowny face, or scared face. And there's really no differentiation in between what scared face looks like and frowny face. Now for the student, it doesn't tell the student what they need to do to go from frowny face to happy face. And for the teacher, there's really no description so that the teacher can use it consistently in terms of what makes the teacher feel frowny face or happy face. And in a lot of ways, the teacher's mood can also influence how this particular tool is used. So we want to be really consistent. We would therefore have to write out what does following directions look like in an ideal situation, and then what would it look like at any of those levels beneath it. Also, I would be careful of terms like some of the time and most of the time. If you're going to write a rubric and to say that the student follows directions some of the time or student follows directions most of the time, I'd ask you, what is the difference between some and most? Quite honestly, when I'm in a bad mood versus when I'm in a good mood, some and most might look a little different. We want to remember that we want to be very, very clear. So is some a student who does it at least half the time, and then most would be over 3/4 of the time? What does that really look like? Same goes for use of words like fair or poor. Describe what fair really looks like, and so you can be sure that every time you have the same definition. Now there are exceptions, of course. Don't feel like the use of the word some is necessarily a bad thing. If you only had 3 rating categories and you had a student who did it all the time, some of the time, or never, that's very clear and cut and dry, and so you'll get really good data from an example like that. So how do we determine appropriate criteria? Usually each of those rows are going to be areas that are key to student learning. We call those the essential skills, or you might call them power standards, or you might call them some of the most priority skills. Either way, they have to be definable, observable, and distinct. By definable, we mean that each criterion has a clear and agreed upon meaning so that both the teacher and the student understand what that means. Observable really means that each criterion describes a quality in the performance that we can perceive. So it has to be something that we can either see or hear. It can't be something that's very intangible because it'll be hard for you to describe that on the rubric. It also needs to be distinct. So you don't want 2 rows to measure the same thing. So each row should be distinct from the next, identifying a separate aspect of the learning you're trying to measure. Often, rubrics that are comparable for growth are not characteristic of the task itself, but rather of the enduring outcomes that the assessment's going to measure. I also want you to think about your rubric not listing every single possible criteria. This is obviously going to become burdensome for the teacher to implement, so rather think about what are the right criteria for this particular assessment's purpose, and let's focus on that. Okay, let's talk about the columns next. The columns are the different levels of performance, ranging from ideal to not evident at all. Each of these should be a descriptive language that should describe what one would observe. We're not looking for quality conclusions. We're not looking for words like good or fair or a smiley face. We want to say, what would it look like if a student did this in the ideal sense? Students should be able to understand the meaning of each of those descriptions. If they're very clear, the teacher should be able to use it in a repeatable fashion. It's also important that you represent all levels of potential performance. So these should be looking at from the highest level of performance all the way down to the lowest or not evident. Sometimes the highest category is going to be above grade level. That doesn't mean you have to make the highest category your A. You could make A what you would consider appropriate for your course, but you may end up having students that score very, very high. And if you want to capture that, you may end up thinking about expanding your rubric. And of course, your descriptions need to be parallel. I recommend that you start with the highest level or ideal, copy and paste that one level down, change a few words, and move on in that fashion. Therefore, each of your descriptors are very parallel, and you can compare them to talk about learning and growth over time. So if we're going to be using our rubrics to get growth data, we might want to use them a little differently than we've used rubrics in the past, because remember that your data needs to be comparable between 2 points. So you're going to want to use your rubric in a very comparable way between those 2 different data points. That means you're going to want to use end of the year expectations. You're going to want to use that rubric consistently so that you get really reliable and comparable data. What would be really dangerous is if you graded the students very easy using that rubric at the beginning of the instructional interval. And then when you're trying to measure the post-test or measure growth, you use that rubric in a much harder fashion, in a much more strict fashion, and therefore students don't show much growth. Not because they didn't grow and learn, but in fact students were graded harder on a subsequent assessment. So we want to make sure that we're not grading harder, but we're grading consistently. And a great rubric will help improve that reliability. Now, the problem we obviously face with the grade book is that if you're going to grade at the end of the year expectations on your baseline assessment, you will not want to give the students that score as a grade, because typically students are not going to do very well, which makes sense because you haven't taught the material yet. I would recommend that you either use it as a participation grade, use it on a curve. So A is maybe not given for the highest rating. Maybe your expectation is the students are at a 2 or a 3 for an A. Maybe you allow the student to revise and work on it and improve their grade. But whatever you do, I don't recommend that you necessarily use end of the year expectations in the grade book. We also have to consider the idea of a baseline assessment being potentially dangerous for student frustration levels and concerns. Anytime you implement baseline data assessment, you are going to be measuring student learning in something they have not been taught. This immediately causes some degree of frustration. Therefore, how you implement this as a teacher is so important. Of course, if you tell the students that the expectation is that they should do well, they'll be very frustrated and hurt by this assessment. But if you tell the students that this is to find out what they'll know over the course of this year, and maybe even using it as an advertisement for your class, telling the students, hey guys, this is what you're going to be awesome at by the time I'm done with you. So stick with me, and by the time you're done, this is going to be easy. Working with the students so that they know that they're not expected to be very knowledgeable about whatever you're asking them to do. Additionally, thinking about exasperation cut points might be helpful. It may be important to build in points where you say, you know what, we've gone as far as we're going to go. Thank you for trying, and proceed to move on at that point. You don't need to go through the entire cycle with the students if you feel that they don't know anything and you're just going to continue to build frustration. For example, if we have 26 letters in the alphabet and we're going to show a kindergartner these letters, after they don't know a certain number of the letters, we can have an exasperation cut point as opposed to giving them all 26 letters and making them cry in frustration. So we want to work with our students and do this in the right way, but we also want to get good baseline data based on what they know at this initial point. So I hope you started to get some understanding of how important a good rubric is. And quite honestly, your rubric is the most important piece of any open-ended assessment. Measuring growth with performance assessments, measuring growth with constructed response or essays or even discussions, all of that is a fabulous way to learn about how your students are growing in your course or your class. But at the same time, it's important that the rubric you're using is a reliable tool that's going to give you really high quality data. If you're ready for more and you want some more information on this topic, don't forget to follow us on Twitter or like us on Facebook. We're always sharing more articles and tools related to measuring student growth using rubrics. Thanks and have a great day.